to. The thing of James can be hard because we're looking at it so deeply, but James is building an argument. A lot of people, they come to James, and if they're not sure what he's doing, it looks like he just has a lot of random teaching, sort of like the book of Proverbs. But he's slowly building an argument. So all the themes that come up in this first chapter will be repeated over and over for the next 4 chapters. And so he starts with the whole idea of trials, the joy in trials. He's going to talk a lot about the use of wealth and money within the Christian community and how the Christian community should respond to those with wealth. He talks about then temptation because of what they're suffering and the where they might, that temptation might lead them. And then he kind of pulls them back to, as people who follow the Messiah, Jesus, that they have to recall again sort of the way they're supposed to live. And so he first has this, 3 verses that kind of are speaking of particular, we call them exhortations. So he gives us sort of 3 in quick succession. He says, know this is verse 19. Know this, my dear brothers, everyone should be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of a man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. Now on page 13 of the handout, I described these a little bit about what James is saying, especially from the biblical tradition and Jesus tradition from the Gospels. First thing, James says, as a Christian, we have to be quick to hear. He means that in 2 ways, because it'll become more obvious as we go along. One, we have to be quick to hear what the Bible teaches us. In other words, we have to be open and receptive. I want to hear, if this is the Word of God, and I believe that, then in Mass I should be really paying great attention to it. Not just to the homily, those may be good or bad, but to what God actually says in the Word. And so if I'm really open to it, I need to be quick to hear it. In other words, I want to be open and receptive. But it also means that on a personal level, that we have to be open to listening to the other person. Right? If they're talking and you're already thinking your response, you've already stopped hearing them, or listening, I should say. Maybe you're hearing, but you're not listening. He's saying you really need to be open to other people. The simple act of being open can sometimes itself just bring about healing and restoration. By not putting up a front, not immediately but just be quick to hear, right? Be a person who's open to listening to others. Don't rush in. And these are all interconnected. From that flows slow to speak. So be quick to hear. You want to hear the Word of God. You want to hear what your brother or sister is trying to communicate to you. But then in return, you have to be slow to speak. You have to show restraint. 1, so you are actually listening. It shows your humility in wanting to hear. And it also helps you to avoid rash judgment. Look at this Old Testament quote from Proverbs. And she says, those who spare their words are knowledgeable. Even fools keeping silent are considered wise. Think of Peter, always talking. That always gets you in trouble if you don't shut up, right? That you start going, and it happens to me. I'll be teaching class and I'll start going off, and I'm like, I went too far. I'll come back and sort of reel it in. I'm not just talking about going on tangents. I mean, you delve into stuff. You say something that was more your opinion than something. That's what he's talking about. He's saying, be slow to speak. Don't assume a rash judgment about the person or what's being said. Don't be humble to listen. There's a particular sin. The word in Greek, you see it now all the time. In fact, I think it's even the name of like a movie company. But synecdoche. Synecdoche is a sin. Now, it basically is rash judgment. But what is the sin of synecdoche specifically? And it's become, I think, more prominent because of social media than it ever was. It's always been around, but it's become more easy, I should say now. The sin of synecdoche is this. It is to take one trait of a person and believe you know everything about them through that trait. So you're in a chat room and somebody's a Democrat or a Republican or an evangelical or an atheist or a homosexual. Pick your thing. And that one word, and you know it all. You know what they're like, who they hang out with, what their moral life, right? We make the judgment based on one thing, defining a person through one little characteristic. And so the church, that's part of rash judgment, but it's a little bit different. That's the sin of synecdoche. They've never even translated it out of Greek. To make those assessments based on just one thing. And it's funny because in a sense, we both do this, but sometimes we do it to ourselves, right? Any one of those labels I just had, that might be how you portray yourself out there. So in a sense, you synecdochize yourself. You say, like a person who's a homosexual or something, it's all about well, that's not their whole life. That's actually one tiny part of their life. But if that's all they're portraying, they're catching themselves in the sin themselves, against themselves, and making it easier for other people to sin by saying, well, that's who you are too. So, I mean, it's something we can do to ourselves, it's something that others can do to us, but it's this idea of really thinking we know the totality and mystery of another human being, that we can judge and understand them, usually in a bad way, is what we're making the judgment about. But that's this rash judgment. And then finally, we have to be slow to wrath, so as not to act in anger. And James tells us why. Quote, the wrath of a man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. Like the biblical tradition in general, James recognizes anger can be justified at times. He does realize that. Notice he says slow to wrath, which recognizes sometimes wrath is good. Paul says something similar. He says, be angry, but do not sin, is how Paul puts it in one of his letters. The problem both men are trying to tell us is this. First of all, anger is the only one of the 7 deadly sins that is not always sinful. However, because most of us justify our anger by believing it's really righteous anger, it's stemming from pride or something else. That's why James says, your anger is not going to accomplish what God wants done. There are some things you should be angry about. And if you're not angry, actually there's maybe something a little bit wrong with you as a Christian. Right? You should be angry at certain sins publicly happening and things like that. But at the same time, if you approach things in anger, and it really isn't righteous anger, then you're only going to throw fuel on the fire. You're not going to come to the situation and make it better, you're going to come and make it worse. And so James, notice it's all about the language right now. If I can really briefly jump up to verse 26 of chapter, the last part of chapter 1. And we'll come back to it later, but I want to tie it into what he's saying here, because it's kind of his concluding sentence. He said, or paragraph. He says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, his religion is vain. Right? That's what James is talking about. This is another place that's challenging, because for most of us, I don't think we think our words are that really big a deal to God. I mean, we know there's certain things I shouldn't have said that and stuff, but do we really realize how serious God takes our anger and our statements made in anger? And so I want to give you a statement from Jesus, because what James is saying is he's telling us that's part of real religion. If you can't control your mouth, whether you're actually saying it out loud or whether you're just thinking it, still the same thing, then you're not as religious as you think. You're not as like Jesus, like God as you think you are. And here's what Jesus says. You're at the very bottom of page 13. Quote, you have heard that it was said to your ancestors, you shall not kill. And whoever kills will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka, will be answerable to the Sanhedrin. Raka is, we don't have a term in English for it. It's kind of like a kid's way of, like, you know, like when a little kid goes, you're stupid. And you're kind of like, all right, you know, whatever, you're 4. You know, you're not really, hopefully not worried about the little 4-year-old calling. It's a child's insult. But notice Jesus says, you'll be answerable to the Sanhedrin, right? The religious court. Whoever says, you fool, will be liable to fiery Gehenna. Words. Why? Because if it really reflects your heart, you're a murderer in your heart. You hate that person. That's all it takes. Jesus is clear. It's worthy of hell. Again, like I said, we never think that way almost ever, that what we say, unless it's like the most egregious thing we can think of. But simply name calling and such, but Jesus tells us it reflects something. It reflects who you really are. Aquinas used to say, he said, he had a silly little thing he did for his class. He had different fruits. It wasn't an orange, because they didn't have oranges. I want to say it was a pomegranate. He said, if I squeeze this pomegranate and I break it open, what comes out? And the class, pomegranate juice. He goes, if I squeeze this, will I ever get apple juice? No. If I squeeze, and he went through these things. Then very astutely he said, so if I squeeze you, what comes out? That's the point. Our real colors are shown when we're under stress and pressure. That's who you are. Not who you want to be in the times when nothing's happening. That's a mirage. Who you really are, what comes out of you. If someone presses your buttons, are you able to accept that? Or do you call them the fool? Because that's who you are. That's what's really inside. And that's what James and Jesus, by his statement, is telling us, that things we take so for granted, we don't realize reflect far deeper than we give it credit for. He's not talking about just because someone grew up in a bad neighborhood and they have bad slang. He's talking about a whole way of referring and talking and addressing human beings and people. Not just kind of a custom that's come about, which is still bad, but he's talking about this anger. Let's follow what he says. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there recall your brother has anything against you, notice he's talking, again, a pericope. The fact that these are joined together show he's talking about the sin of anger that your brother has against you. Then leave your gift there on the altar, go first and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. That's sort of why we do the Confiteor in Mass today, because that's your time to really unburden yourself of those sins, not mortal sins per se, but of those less serious sins. And the Confiteor says, as long as you openly acknowledge them while you're praying it and ask for forgiveness and our desire forgiveness, those venial sins are completely forgiven. It can never take the place of confession for serious sin, but any of those daily sins we fall into over and over again. Anyway, back to Jesus. And then it becomes a little more, Jesus really makes it a little bit scary, as he did more often than we realize when we start to read the Bible more. He says, settle with your opponents quickly while on the way to court with him. Otherwise, your opponent will hand you over to the judge will hand you over to guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Amen, I say to you, you will not be released till you have paid the last penny. Jesus is telling us a very difficult principle. Is God merciful? Absolutely. Does he forgive? Absolutely. Does he require restitution for every wrong you did, though, still? Absolutely. And if you don't undo it here, you will undo it in purgatory until you pay the last penny. God's mercy doesn't mean his justice is set aside. It means the ultimate verdict is still in your favor, but you still have to make up for what you did. God's whole character, that's what he's revealed himself as through his whole existence. When he came and Moses said, let me see your glory, God said, you can't see me. No one can see me and live if you have even the slightest sin. It's actually kind of Hebrew humor, which I guess is God humor. Because what God actually says I shouldn't laugh, it's really kind of bad. But anyways, in Exodus, Moses says, let me see your glory. He says, no one can see me than live. And Moses says, please let me see you. God says, you can see my backside, which literally in Hebrew, you can see my butt. That's what he tells Moses. So I'll pass before you, but I'm going to cover your face. And when only my butt's visible, you can see it. Well, obviously, God doesn't have a butt. But the point being, you can see only the least important, most you can't even begin to comprehend who I am, Moses. The point being, I got off track, see? The point being, as he passes, God states the statement that sort of becomes central to Israel. He says, the Lord, merciful and gracious, and forgiving people to 1,000 generations, but never calling the guiltless or the guilty guiltless. In other words, you're saved. It doesn't mean you're not guilty. You still have to pay for your crimes, and you will, but if you tip the scale in your own merciful behavior, then God is merciful. That's how God has always revealed himself. And that's what James, being just immersed in his Jewish tradition and in the experience of Jesus, understands as well. For example, just really briefly, here's where is he? In chapter 2, he says, where is it? Oh, I can't find it. Chapter 2, verse 12. So speak and act, notice speak are words and act are physical actions. That's all what James has been leading up to. As people who will be judged by the law of freedom. Right? God's freed you from the power of sin so that you make your own choices to cooperate with his grace or not. For the judgment is merciless to the one who has not shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Whose mercy? Yours. If you're not merciful, you don't get God's mercy. If you're merciful, you triumph over the judgment that by all rights should be yours. You save your life by loving neighbor. And that's what James, the argument he's building up to this point, is leading to. That mercy is defined as doing good works of charity to the poor, to those. Not just others, to the needy, So everything about James is an absolutely Jewish messianic letter, which puts it entirely in line with Jesus, his kinsman. Now, another part, just to kind of connect this a little more, if you go to Matthew chapter 12, and this has another little just statement. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 33, Jesus again is talking about the whole idea of a tree and fruits. What I did here is, James has sort of vocabulary he uses. Faith alone hears the powerful of the rich on one side versus those with faith works, doers, and the lowly on this side. John uses different terminology, darkness versus light, children of the devil versus children of God. Jesus talked about being a hearer only versus being one who hears and acts. Jesus talks about the person who has bad fruit or no fruit versus those who have good fruit. And that's one of these statements now, the tree and its fruit. So here's Jesus. He says, verse 33, either declare the tree good and its fruit is good, or declare the tree rotten and its fruit is rotten. For a tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, children of the snake. Right? It's the story of Genesis 3:16 when God made the pronouncement. He goes, in Genesis, he says, I'll put enmity between you, Satan, and the woman, and between your offspring, plural, and hers, us. And then he, the one single son, will crush your head. So who are the children? Who are Satan's offspring? Well, there you have it. Brood, family of vipers, poisonous snakes. John just makes it easy for us, children of the devil. So he says, brood of vipers. He goes, a good person brings, for out of the fullness, sorry, I lost my place. 34. You brood of vipers, how can you say good things when you are evil? For from the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. That's what Aquinas was talking about. What you say reflects reality. Oh, you might have nice speech for a while. That's what Jesus is saying. How can you're evil, but you have nice sounding speech? But if people push you hard enough, you're going to slip eventually because the real you can't be hidden that long. And so you might be nice at the conference table or where you have to be, but then you step outside and we'll see how things happen. So Jesus, again, notice it's all about our speaking. A good person brings forth good out of a store of goodness, but an evil person brings forth evil out of a store of evil. Now here's the last two verses are the clincher. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will render an account for every careless word you speak. By your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned. So just remember that when you leave today. Every single thing you say will be open fodder for the entire human race. Everyone up there gets to see who you called a jackass in your heart, right? Everyone up there gets to see how you badmouthed at home or gossiped about them. Everything. They'll all be laid bare, right? Believe me, heaven is only for the humble because you'll have been humiliated to that point if you make it. And I say that in all honesty. That's why you should ask for it now. Humble me now, Lord, because I really don't want to get there and have more to deal with, you know. This verse and things like, think of your deceased family and friends, right? Think of the cloud of witnesses. You know Jesus is there, but maybe it makes it a little more concrete. Think that your grandma is up there watching you when you're like flipping somebody off or something, and really make you think, everybody's viewing this, right? Everyone in heaven, like the cheerleaders, they're all got you going, and they're watching you, dude, flipped off the driver. See, now we gotta work on that dude some more. So, but I'm making light of it, but notice how serious Jesus takes it, right? It makes us remember we really have to work on our speech. Right, there's a reason why in Mass, at the Confiteor, we say, in my thoughts, and in my words, and then what I've done and failed to do. And then later, so we admit where we failed, and one of those areas is speech. It's considered so important, it's its own area in Scripture. And that's why right before we hear the gospel, which will be able to open us up to what we're really supposed to be living, that's why we make the 3 crosses where we make them. Over where thoughts come from, over where words come from, and in the Hebrew understanding, the heart is the place of decision and action. It's not a place of emotion like in the Western world. That's the intestines for Hebrew. So, and that's why we make the 3 crosses where we do. So we have this in our Mass, we just don't really know what it means, other than we want to be open to it in our mind, speak it, and live it in our heart. And that's fine, that's true. But it'll come up whether forgiven or not. Others know the forgiven ones won't be. But the problem is they talk about God. The problem is a language barrier sometimes, especially in the Old Testament more than the New. When God talks about not remembering people's sins, it simply means that he doesn't hold them guilty. It doesn't mean like they're not there anymore. In a sense, I'll tell you the majority opinion, if there is one, at least the most scholars that I'm aware of, Orthodox scholars, most fall on the side of everything will be revealed. Because in that, God's justice will be more absolutely known than if you hit everything people did and just said, oh, you're good, you only have these like 5 or 6 sins that like were left over. No, everything has to see so that everyone can see everything. And it's not just, we have to be careful. It's not just so each of us like takes our turn and gets,
roasted,
wedgied or something, or roasted at the thing. It's to also see the interconnection of everybody. Why everyone who's there is there and should be, and why everyone who's not is likewise why they're not there. So it's not just for our personal kind of embarrassment. It's actually to show the mercy of God that look at all these things. And the thing is that we need to remember, although it's terrifying, is we're all in the same boat. I mean, that's the point, is no one's there'll be very few except some of the great, great, great living saints, who will just be kind of blasé about it. Whatever, you know what I did. I mean, right, for most of us, we're all going to be, it's not like, oh, look at them, because your turn's coming. Or it's not your turn, it's all revealed to everybody sees it. So it's to show the love of God, the mercy of God, no matter what, and also to show his justice, that he was a person who was concerned with justice. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted and God was okay with it. He's not permissive, he's merciful. So that would be the opinion, but the church doesn't have a teaching on that, because the scripture is not always directly part of that. Okay, from the catechism I just listed, so we have an idea of how serious sins of the tongue, as they're called, are. So there are 8 that are listed in the catechism. And this is page 18. We'll go back then. I think I want to cover this now, though, while we're talking about sins of the tongue. The first one is blasphemy. So uttering words of hatred, reproach, defiance, and ill will towards God and other sacred persons and things, abusing or misusing his name, cursing in his name, swearing oaths in his name lightly, and using his name in a superstitious or magical way. Those are all the sin of blasphemy, as the church understands it. Promises made in his name must be honored, or they make God into a liar. That's why God holds you responsible. That's also why no divorce no remarriage can happen without an annulment. Because in the marriage oath, you take God as your witness that this will last. And when it doesn't, you make him a liar. And that's unacceptable. So there has to be a special thing done in order to overcome that. Also, swearing a false oath in his name harms his honor. Knowingly making a promise, whether it's in a formal setting like a courtroom, or whether it's in a business deal, or just on a personal level, that's also. So those are sin of blasphemy. Then there's false witness and perjury. The church teaches that one cannot make a public statement that they know is contrary to the truth. Perjury is making such a knowingly false statement under oath, or in making a promise under oath that one has no intention of keeping. Number 3, rash judgment. One may not tacitly assume the moral fault of another as true without sufficient foundation. This often leads to gossip and ruining a person's reputation. The Greek term synecdoches means to see a person, thing, or event only through the lens of one aspect of it, seeing it as totally understood by a single trait. This is a sin. So rash judgment. And it's just our human nature. We all have an in crowd and an out crowd based on our personal sort of groups. And we're always easy to immediately find fault in the out crowd, where the exact same behavior by someone in our in crowd we excuse immediately, right? In politics, in international relations, in war, in whatever you name it, even on a more personal level, it always happens. And that all falls under the sin of rash judgment. Detraction. One who discloses another's faults and failings to persons who did not know them without an objectively valid reason. So you're not allowed to tell even truthful things that are bad, unless it's for a formal reason. If someone's a criminal, that needs to be told to the proper authorities or things like that. But I know we don't like it because it puts us in an odd place, but it makes you have to think about certain things that you know and that come into your understanding and knowledge. Do I have the right to tell somebody else about this? And if I am telling them about it, what's my notice objectively? In other words, on the surface of what the church teaches, can you objectively prove that your reason for doing it was good and valid? Seeing a criminal brought to justice is. Hurting someone's reputation and embarrassing them publicly isn't, just because you think they deserve it because they're a real jerk to everybody. That's not objectively valid. So we have to be careful. That's why Paul has the statement, he says, speak the truth with love. To speak the truth in Latin is candor. Candor is a sin unless the reason you speak it is for the betterment of things. If I tell something that's true, but I do it to embarrass someone, or to show them I was right, or to humiliate them and that they were wrong, or any of those reasons, I'm not coming from a place of love. I'm coming from somewhere else. And so while I'm speaking truth, my motivation is evil. And that destroys the validity of the fact that it's true. When you think of our news media, this is all over the place. And talk about rash judgment, again, the social media has destroyed, in that sense, any objectivity that we used to find. We can always complain about whether the news was objective or not, but I would still guarantee before the last 20 years, it's become far less than before, because every John, Tom, and Harry has their blog, website, this, that, and it's difficult because on the one hand, communication is furthered by something like the internet and social media. On the other hand, real communication is hindered because now you have to wade through so many things of what could be true or not, and this or that, and everyone's jumping to conclusions, and so it's difficult. We live in a world that's just immersed in this, and it's hard not to get caught up in it. Calumny is one makes remarks contrary to the truth that harms another reputation by giving others occasion for false judgments concerning them. So, when you basically hint at something that the person is, even if you know it's not true, to kind of give them a bad name. Boasting. Boasting about oneself is an offense against truth, as is the use of irony aimed at disparaging another by maliciously caricaturing some aspect of them. Using flattery, adulation, or complacence to encourage and or confirm another person's malicious acts or perverse conduct. And then, of course, obviously, lying in order to intentionally deceive. And also to lead another person into error in general. So, you can see that although it's not something we probably talk about a lot or maybe even think about in our own spiritual lives, Jesus put a huge premium on it. James is simply reflecting that. And the Catechism of the Church, when we actually look it up under the commandments, gives us a lot of ways in which we have to really be careful with how we speak. The more you want to be a witness to the world of the truth and the person of Christ, the more we have to realize that's not just what we do, it's not just what we claim to believe, it's a lot of times just very concrete. How do I act in a certain situation? How do I speak to people? I'll give you a personal example. When I was at St. Timothy's years ago, there was a lady who came into the RCIA program. And it was a real difficult year for her to do it. Not because RCIA was difficult, she was certain she wanted to be Catholic. But her entire family were hardcore evangelical Christians. So she sustained unrelenting kind of frustration at her home from her teenage children, from her husband, everything else. So it was a long road for her. Well, she becomes Catholic, and only about a year and a half later, her daughter, because I met the daughter a few times, I go into what used to be called, I think it's called Anthem Church Supply now, but it used to be in Escondido. Now it's got a huge place down in Mira Mesa or something. But it was just a little church supply store. She was in there one day, and I knew her in the background. So I asked her, I said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And she said, well, she was thinking about RCIA and the job had opened up, and so she took the job, and she was, kind of checking out Catholicism. And then a few months later, I'd see her a lot, and we'd talk, and then I went a few times, and I didn't see her, and a lot of people worked there, so I didn't think anything of it. And then finally it had been about a month, and I hadn't seen her. And so another lady worked there who I knew, and I asked her, I said, where's such and such? And she said, oh, I don't know, she got another job or something. So it's like a year after that, and I forget where I was, and I ran into her. And I said, I haven't seen you in so long, how's it going? Well, come to find out, the reason she left the job and turned her back completely on Catholicism is working in a church supply store. She said the worst human being she'd ever come into contact with is rudeness and self-importance were all the priests. Oh. And she wanted nothing. Now this is 25 years ago. I mean, this is not anything like brand new, and it's not to that level, but just the rudeness. And I've encountered that in my own life. There was a priest I worked for once, and anytime I mentioned another priest, he gave a scowl, like it was a competition. I'd be like, oh, Father such and such, what did he do? And I'm like, I don't know, I thought it was good, but I'm not going to tell you anymore now. I'm not sitting here to put the blame on priests, but I'm just simply saying, if we are known as followers of Christ, and you're out saying the same things as everybody else, you go out to happy hour and you're gossiping like everybody else, and everybody there at the table knows you're a Catholic who's in Mass on Sunday, well, you've felt a disconnect, right? And it's hard. It doesn't mean you have to be the sourpuss who just, berates everybody, but you can be quiet. Even just not joining in, at least, is the first step of, everyone else is making their things, and you're like, just have a good time for everything else. And I realize it's hard. Again, that's why the church, Christianity, let's be honest, Christianity is the hardest religion. I'm not just saying that because we're Christian. Buddhism and Hinduism are so particular in their rules. Islam, with the Quran, it's so absolute. But with you and I, we're given a command of love. And that command can never be fully satisfied. You'll never love correctly enough, well enough, ever, right? There'll always be a sort of dissatisfaction if we're really growing in faith. And the reason I say that is a lot of times people will ask me questions, but the questions they're asking is a very particular one. So they're not asking like, what is the church teaching on burial or something? It'll be like, I have a sister who has this, and what do I say? And I know sometimes I sound like an idiot, but the point is, a lot of times I can't tell you what to say. That's the point of your conscience and that whole understanding of, if you know what the church teaches, you know the situation, the person, I don't. Therefore, you take all of that into account in how you handle something. I'll give you another example. I used to work with someone, and I'm still good friends with them. I love her. But we both work for the church. We go out to lunch a lot of times, and a waitress, something would come bad, and the poor waitress would just get this barrage, right? And you're sitting there. My dad used to call it AA. Asshole by association. Sorry. You're sitting there and they're being so rude to this other person. And here, I'm wearing my cross and everything else, and they're screaming at this waitress who doesn't cook the food. I always want to tell her. But anyway, but here's my point. The way I would handle that, if possible, is I'd be like when we were going to leave or something, I'd say I have to go to the restroom or something, and I'd try to apologize to that person. Because I knew this woman well enough that if I said anything to her, she would be so offended, we probably wouldn't be friends anymore. Oh, yeah. And so I knew that. And so that's where real life happens. I recognize you can't be fully Christian. We really want to be, but we can't be. And God even recognizes that. He doesn't want that relationship broken just because I'm going to be able to correct her and set her straight, So it's instead trying not to take part, sometimes just praying for the person, praying to God while it's happening, saying, Lord, I know you hate what's going on, and I'm so sorry that I'm even connected with this in some way. So I guess my point is just telling you, I know it takes work, right? That's why we have to grow spiritually. We can't just be satisfied if I go to Mass once a week and say like my meal prayers and stuff during the week, when these situations arise of real faith, that I'm going to have a good answer. No, I need to be a person of prayer. I need to hear the scriptures either at Mass or read them. I need to learn my faith more so that I can respond to these things, knowing that that's why it's called the law of freedom. I mean, some obvious rules apply. We know, you can't kill people, but then as you're stretching out, well, how do I turn this into love? Right? Jesus makes it more difficult. But that's why he says, if your righteousness doesn't surpass the scribes and Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom of God. And he gave us the example. He said, you've heard it said, don't kill people. That's the law. Okay? The Pharisees, they're there. Yeah, you can't kill people. Boom. But he says, but I say, if you're even angry. See, so we're to further go beyond just the literal rule into this whole understanding of as seen through love. In other words, every single command is transformed by looking at it through the lens of Christ's love of neighbor. And so now it's not enough, for example, not to kill. I also am called not to be angry, that leads to violence, at least interiorly. And I'm also called to do the opposite, to actually support life. I'm not simply not to steal. I'm asked to be generous with what I have to those who don't have. And so on and so forth. So that the law becomes, for me, expansive. That's why I have to do more than the Pharisees and such. He's talking about the fact that I don't have an easy answer to everything, where I can just say, this is, I told you it's black and white. And it is true, but in our messy human lives, we can't always easily distinguish that. And so I have to and we live in a world that's fallen. And that's just part of it. I'm not talking about, not living up to the faith or denying the faith. I'm simply saying how we concretely have to act in certain circumstances according to our faith. You can't give a one answer to. There is no answer to that. It's simply you act like Christ to the best of your knowledge and ability. That's what you do. Right? Jesus didn't correct every infraction he saw. He knew that would be a waste of time. He knew who to talk to, when to approach it, which specific thing to say. So there's a host of issues that we all fall into that we need to kind of deal with. And that's, in this case, we've just looked at one particular one. Okay. Let's just start a little bit, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end. So let's just see what he says here, and then kind of prepare ourselves for next time. Following almost exactly what Jesus talked about in the man who set his house on rock versus sand, verse 22. Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deluding yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his own face in a mirror. He sees himself, then goes off and promptly forgets what he looked like. But the one who peers into the perfect law of freedom and perseveres is not a hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts. And such a one will be blessed in what he does. Weird image, I know, kind of. I mean, in one sense we get it, but you might still be going, I'm not entirely sure where he's coming from. James is saying this. When you hear the gospel proclaimed, the gospel does two things. It inspires and encourages you, right? It gives you this great good news about God. But at the same time it does that, the gospel confronts you because you see who you really are in terms of the gospel, right? That's why you look in the mirror. The gospel shows you who you are. You're a sinner. This is what you need to do. The person who's heard the message, they hear it, they're the person who looks, they know what they're supposed to do, they hear what the gospel says, they hear Jesus talk about changing your speech, and they go off and they promptly just go to mass every week and they don't really care what's actually said in the homily. The doer is the one who hears it and they realize, and now I have to do something. Now I have to do something. That's why it's freedom. God doesn't force you. He doesn't, wrestle you down and say, you have to do this. No, he leaves it up to you. Are you going to respond by doing, or are you going to be only a hearer? See, James will change his language. Right now he's talking about hearers and doers. It's what he means later by faith alone versus faith works. The faith alone person could be 100% orthodox. He or she could have the entire Bible and catechism memorized. They could go to Mass every single day of their lives. They could do all those things. They say the creed, they believe it 100%. But they don't do anything that it actually tells them to do, actively. And so their faith, James tells us, is worthless. In fact, he says it's no better than the most evil things that exist. He says, look at verse 18. Indeed, someone may say, you have faith and I have works. Demonstrate your faith to me without works, and I will demonstrate my faith to you from my works. You believe God is one. You do well. Right? That's Orthodox faith. You believe in what the church teaches. Look at the next line. Even the demons believe that and tremble. Right? Demons know theology better than any person in this room. They're not saved by that knowledge. Think about it. When Jesus cast people out, what did they always knew who he was. Why are you here, the Holy One of God? Silence. He didn't want them to spill the beans, but they knew who he was. They know all about the plan of God. They know everything like that. They know God is probably, in some sense, more than us, but not really, because we have the Spirit in us. But they're not there. Now, what James does here is he's still making the same argument. It's not as clear because, again, he's coming from a Jewish place. The Jews' confession of faith is known as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and spirit. Basically, it's Deuteronomy 6:5. It's actually the full Shema is about this long because it's 2 passages from Deuteronomy and 1 from Numbers. But it all has to do with God being the one true God. And so that's part of Jesus' teaching, right? Jesus didn't make that up. He brings it directly over from Israel. Now that's all, even to this day, that's Israel's confession of faith. But all of us know as Christians that Jesus added to it. Not only do you love God with your whole mind and everything else, what else do you have to do? Love your neighbor. And that's also from the Old Testament. It simply wasn't combined in the confession of faith. So James is being more ironic than we think here. He's saying, look, you believe this part, God is one. Good job. Oops, you forgot the point that actually makes that concrete. You have a lot of confessional faith. You know what to say. You know what the church teaches. You don't have a lot of actions. In fact, you don't have any. So, therefore, he tells us, he says, notice what he says. He says it's dead. He says that faith without works. In verse 14, he tells us, what good is it, my brother? Someone says he has faith but does not have works. Can that faith save him? Well, it's a rhetorical question. What's James' answer? No. That's not good enough. That's not good enough. And we know this, because think of the last judgment scene. Did you feed people, give drink, clothe, visit the sick, all those things? He doesn't ask a word about this. It's assumed. Now, why does this get placed so much? Because even, it'll go even beyond this. Although it's the two great commandments, this will be the one highlighted for Christians. Right? Paul will say every command that exists can be summed up in this one. Love your neighbor. James will call it the royal law of love. Love your neighbor as yourself. John will call it the new commandment. Love one another as I love you. Why is this one placed in such huge, place of honor, even above God? James tells us why. A person who says they really love God who they can't see, but denies a brother or sister made in God's image who they can see, is a liar. Therefore, this can't prove anything. But if I'm a Christian and I live my works, it proves I already have this. In other words, it only goes one way. If I have this, I'm guaranteed to have this one. If I have just this, I'm not guaranteed to go anywhere else. I stop. So that's why the church, from the very beginning, puts the accent actually on this one. And I would say it's probably the reverse of most of us today. Right? We think just going to Mass, saying prayers, that's our big stuff. Jesus says, those are nice, but they'll only bear fruit in the end if you actually lived like me. Not just in worship, but in here. Right? There's two real presences. The Eucharist and the neighbor. Because what does he say? What you did to the least, you did to who? Me. He's present. They may not be even aware of his presence, but he is present. So, okay, sorry I'm lying. So next week, like always, we'll start with questions. And I'll have a new handout for next time, but we'll finish up chapter 1. There's still just a couple more things to bring out here. Because James, I keep going back because James is building sort of a sustained argument, one after another. But let's go ahead and end in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty and eternal God, we come before you, Lord, and we actually ask for your grace and your mercy. We know that each and every one of us have fallen short in so many ways, Lord. Sometimes purposely sold, but often just ignorantly so. And so as we come to learn more and more about your will, as we read through your Gospels, your Scriptures, your sacred writings, may we have the courage to do your will. May you give us the opportunities and grace to put it into practice. And most of all, may we experience the joy and peace that comes from actually serving and loving our neighbors. Because not only do we help them physically, but in doing so, we ourselves are strengthened spiritually. For while we give them food, in return, we receive you, Christ yourself, in a more intimate and powerful way. Lord, give us the mind of Christ to be able to see you in our brothers and sisters, and help break our hard-heartedness that just makes us complacent or sort of lazy or self-assured in our own actions, so that we can be more and more open to the gospel, and in that way, truly worship you in the full way that you would have us do, in word and action, in deed and in religion. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Chris?
Yeah.
We have to be